Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this afternoon and welcome to this joint Canberra Business Chamber Australia-China Business Council event where we're launching a report on Australia's trade and economic relationship with China, talking through some of the benefits and benefits to households of that. And then I hope we can have a conversation a little bit later about how businesses here in Canberra and around the country more generally can take advantage of that. If you haven't met me, my name's Greg Harford. I'm the Chief Executive of the Canberra Business Chamber. I'd like to welcome our panellists today. We've got Angela Lehmann, who's the Vice President of the ACBC here in the ACT, and thank you for supporting us with this event today. We've got guest speakers, Dr. Daniel Kiley from Curtin University, beaming in live from Perth any moment, so he's up there on the screen now. Wayne Smith from the Smart Energy Council, Chris Gartner from the University of Canberra, and Brendan Smith, the Commissioner of International Engagement from the ACT Government. So before we begin and kick off with the formalities, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank ACT Government for its support of this event and obviously our good friends at King & Wood Mallisons for giving us this fantastic venue to use this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Angela to welcome Dr. Kiley to launch the report.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for being here today. For those of you I don't know, I'm Angela Lehmann. I'm the Vice President of the ACBC here in Canberra, along with Mr. Charles Jun, who is sitting here in the audience today. I send apologies from Jenny Chen, who's our President, who is unable to be with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this magnificent land that we're meeting on today, albeit a little bit cold and rainy, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. It's a significant time, I think, to be having this conversation, particularly as we're entering an election time, that it is even more important to be dealing with evidence-based arguments, and this report is a fantastic resource for us as we're going into a time where we may be hearing more and more discussions about international trade and indeed China in particular. I'd like to acknowledge Councillor Wong, who is here today from the Chinese Embassy on behalf of Minister Gao, who is unable to be here just now. He may attend a little later. And of course, Mr. Brendan Smythe from the ACT Government. I'd like to acknowledge also the wonderful support and partnership of the the Canberra Business Chamber, and also the ACT Government for supporting this event. And of course, King & Wood Mallison for the wonderful venue, the beautiful view, and the lovely coffee and snacks. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Daniel Kiley, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Bankwest Curtin Centre for Economics. I apologise if I've got that wrong, who is going to give our keynote address today about the Australia-China trade relationship and the benefits for households. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kiley.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you to everyone for engaging in this event today and for participating. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here in Western Australia. We have the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to thank the Australia-China Business Council for providing the funding for us to conduct this report. It's been really great engaging with ACBC, and we've held roundtable events across many of the states and territories, which has been fantastic to see, and some great discussions and insights emerging from those opportunities. Again, thanks to the members there at the ACT Chamber and Council, and for their again engagement and invitation to present the findings to you all here today. When the ACBC engaged with us for this report, just in terms of context, we did a report that focused on WA last year, And on the back of that, there was interest to look at something similar nationally. We all know that China is critically important in its trade, and our trade relationship with China is really important from an economic and social perspective. But less is understood about the benefits to Australian households. So that was the key focus of this report. And again, where possible, we delved into looking at those benefits across all of the states and territories across Australia. Again, I would just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, as you see on the screen here, and Abiba is here with me in the room as well and has played a key role in this work. Before I get into the findings, it's important that we put our relationship with China in a broader global context. We, as I said, know that China is a key trading partner with us. They've had significant growth over the last number of decades, and we saw that slow, of course, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it remained positive and stronger than that which we've seen across many of the other nations across the globe. That's been really important for us here in Australia, as again we've managed to keep our growth rates reasonably high, and again that relationship is really important in that regard. Again, in more recent times, there's been concerns about declining economic growth in China and the impacts of slower construction sector on the back of the housing market there in China. But again, just as of this week, we've seen announcements around the stimulus measures, and we've seen a response in terms of the likes of iron ore price in regards to that. Of course, it remains to be seen over the longer term period whether those stimulus measures will have a real impact on the economy and the longer term impacts it will have on our trade relationship with China. But again, it is positive to see some emerging stimulus there and potential benefits for further economic growth for China. Again, before I get to our main modelling findings, it's important that we set the context here in terms of our trade relationship and how that has transitioned over time. So Australia currently exports around $192 billion in goods exports to China. This is about a third of our overall exports out of the nation. China imports roughly 21% of Australia's agricultural exports and 33% of our resources exports and 10% of our manufactures. So again, it's spread across many of those key industries. Of course, mining in value terms playing a critical role there. But again, we often focus on the export side of it, but China is a critical partner as well for our imports. About a quarter of Australia's total imports come from China. And this is really important for our production processes, for our downstream activities in terms of what we do and the added value that we can add to products here, but also it impacts on households. I'll come to it in a moment, but many of the products that we import from China end up in the average household, whether it be cars, computers, telecommunications equipment, which again play a key role then in terms of our cost of living should we source those from other alternative sources. So again, roughly 33% of Australia's imports of manufacturers and 7% of agricultural imports come from China. Roughly 70% of Australia's exports to China are resources. So again, we know the resources industry is critical. And again, this is in value terms. Of course, here in WA, we know iron ore plays a critical part in that story as well. In terms of imports, again, manufacturers is the key component there. But we also have inputs into our agricultural sector and some food goods as well that come through from China and end up on the plates of Australian households. If we break this down at the state level, again, we know that export to China, it differs substantially across states and territories. So WA, again, is a key highlight where 55% of our overall exports from WA go to China. But it's sizable across other states and territories as well. For Queensland, again, a mining state, Japan comes in first at 19% of their overall trade, but China again is at 17%. For New South Wales, Japan again is at 38%, but China at 9%. Again, for Victoria, 19%, again, the largest trading partner, as is China for South Australia and for Tasmania as well, up there at over 30%. So again, China is key across all of these states, but to varying degrees. When we look at imports, however, we see that China is the dominant trading partner across most of our states and territories. Again, for New South Wales, 30% of overall imports to the state come from China, 23% for Queensland, again for Victoria, 28%, and here in WA, 22% of imports come from China. Naturally, due to its geographical size, the nature of the ACT, we know that trade, particularly goods trade, is a lot smaller from the ACT with China. But of course, there are many intangible benefits as well through the trade relationship and, of course, the federal government's base and relationship with China that comes out of the ACT. So we can't understate that. In 2023, China made up about 23%. Again, in value terms, it's quite small, obviously, as I said, relative to other states and territories. But again, nonetheless, an important trading partner from a goods perspective. Imports, again, smaller value terms. But again, we need to be conscious too that imports that arrive in other states may end up in the ACT, of course, as well. So that's important to be mindful of. We know with the ACT, services trade is a lot more important, particularly international trade, but also international education rather, but of course also business trips, government relationships as well. Services export to China have taken a hit on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we look here on the right-hand side, we can see the sheer scale again of China in terms of services exports. This is for the nation. So in 2018-19, there was around $18.4 billion in exports services delivered to China. Again, our dominant trading partner, followed by the USA. And again, on the bottom left-hand side here, you can see that education-related travel was a key component of that, followed by personal, cultural, and recreational services. However, fast forward to 2023, and we see that China, in this case, its overall share was still 11.4% of overall services trade from Australia, but again, declined substantially from what we saw in 2018-19. Of course, this was to be expected with border closures, and particularly where China was slower in opening its borders than many of the other states or nations that we've seen across the globe. However, a recovery is underway. As of June 2024, there were over 800,000 international student enrolments in Australia. Of these, almost 21% were from China. And again, whilst recovery from China is slower than other nations, again to be expected on the back of those borders reopening at a slower rate than many other nations, it still remains a significant sector. If we look at the ACT in particular here, again, we have in the gold bars here represents all countries, and the maroon bars represents China. So China is, again, a key part of overall total enrolments in the ACT, almost 40%. And again, we can see that a strong recovery. In fact, in 2024, overall enrolments as of May 2024 relative to May in the other years was higher in 2024 for all countries. And we can see again, there is a pickup in the last number of years in terms of enrolments from China again, although we still are off some of the peak levels that we saw prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as I said, positive signs emerging in that regard. So having set that background context data, much of that which you would be aware of, as I said, the key aspect of this report was then to look at, well, what does all of this mean for the average Australian household? What does this trade relationship mean for us? So in terms of looking at this, we have this organising framework which looks at the key channels through which trade with China flows through to the household level. So there are three key components to this. There's a household income effect, there's labour market effect or employment that's generated on the back of this trade, and there's cost of living effects. What I want to stress here is this is about two-way trade, so both exports and imports, because of course with imports in particular that has a key impact on cost of living effects, but also generates employment. We need workers, for example, in our ports, in our transport system, to engage with such import activities. So again, we look to model the impacts of China-Australia trade across these three key dimensions. As I said at the start, we also look at this not just at the national level, but what is the breakdown across each of the states and territories where the quality of the data enables us to do so. So Australia-China trade increased household disposable income by $2,600 per household in 2022-23. So that's the average across the nation. We see that it's particularly high for WA, as denoted on the right-hand side here, at over $8,700 per household. Again, the sheer value of the iron ore sector and our minerals and resources in general playing a key role there. We see it high as well for the Northern Territory on the back of resources sector as well at $2,200. But again, even for New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, we see substantial values here. So the average Australian household benefiting in the nature of about $2,600 across the nation, as I said. What's also important is that we've tracked this over time. So what we can see here is particularly on the back of the signing of CHAFTA, which emerged around 2015, we can see significant growth, the top line here, for the household income benefits that were generated through trade with China. So of course, on the back of CHAFTA, additional trade occurring and investment opportunities, which again impacted on household disposable income. Again, the nature of ACT's economy and the nature of the trade intensity that we see, which is quite low, we see lower benefits to us, ACT average households. But as I said, we can't understate the intangible benefits that emerge from the likes of international education and business travel, and you know, that soft diplomacy that emerges on the back of key activities in the services sector in the ACT as well. Again, we can see here what were the gains in employment. So again, overall for Australia, we see that almost 600,000 additional jobs are created on the back of trade with China. Again, for WA, that sits at about 220,000 jobs and about 140,000 for New South Wales, with again, similarly, almost 100,000 for Queensland and over 100,000 for Victoria. Again, for ACT, a lot smaller, sitting at 460 jobs, which is a small proportion of the overall employment for the territory. But of course, again, the structure of the economy there, the high reliance on government jobs is a critical factor at play there as well. Trade, of course, we know has a key impact on labour dynamics. And again, we've tracked this over time. For the ACT, again, we can see that this employment has been a lot smaller, although it was higher in pre-COVID years. And again, much of that is likely related to the decline in the services sector, which I talked about earlier. And then what about cost of living? We know in Australia at the moment, there's a lot of discussion around household pressures, cost of living impacts across many households. Our modelling shows that if we were to source our imports from alternative sources, so the next best alternative in terms of price, it would cost an additional 4.2% to source those imports. So there would be higher cost of living effects if we were unable to obtain those imports from China. We can see that these benefits are as high as 7.2% for New South Wales and 5% for Victoria. And again, there's a strong correlation to the total value of imports from these states to these cost of living benefits. So on the right-hand side, this chart here, the orange dot represents the total imports from China as imports from China as a share of total imports to those economies. So again, sitting a lot higher for New South Wales and Victoria, and again in turn we see those higher benefits to households through those cost of living effects. Again, this is a summary slide of the key benefits of trade with China at the national level. So as I said, almost 600,000 jobs created, or about 4.3% of overall employment across the nation. Cost of living effects, cost of living would be 4.2% higher, or has been 4.2% lower as a result of trade with China. And again, we can see the benefits in terms of household income, with $2,600 in household disposable income, or 4.6% of average household income, due to Australia-China trade. As I said, we have modelled this across each of the states and territories, and this is a graphical summary of those key trade relationships and the benefits across each of the states and territories. As I said, WA, particularly due to that mining and resources value, comes out on top, but we do see vast and strong benefits across each of the states and territories across the nation. Again, for ACT, as I said, due to the nature of the smaller trade intensity, we do see lower impacts at that level, but at the territory level. But of course, as we can't, as I said, underplay the benefits of the ACT and the role it plays in international education, but also the diplomacy that's brought from our federal government's base being there, and the important relationship. So again, thank you for your time. As I said, these are the highlight presentations. The overall report is available to you, but yeah, keen to hand it back to Angela now. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Daniel. That was a really interesting and useful report, and you're not in the room, but the people here have got copies of the report on the chairs with them, so something to take away. I have to say, I'm fascinated by the scale and size of the relationship. I think it's really interesting that there's 600,000 jobs nearly around Australia which are dependent on that China relationship, and I suspect many people aren't aware of that. So, you know, it's really good to kind of get a greater understanding of that. We're going to sort of turn now to our panelists and ask them to provide some introductory comments about their view of the China relationship, and I guess I'll kick off with Wayne, and just keen to get Wayne your views of kind of what you've learned from the report, how that relates to the work that you do in your organisation. So Wayne Smith is the External Affairs Manager for the Smart Energy Council. He's a political strategist and a lobbyist with over a decade in the renewables industry. As Manager of External Relations for Smart Energy Council, he handles policy, advocacy and strategy, and he's been a senior advisor to federal shadow ministers and worked with both federal and ACT governments. So Wayne, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate that. And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today. And huge congratulations to the Australia-China Business Council on this work as well, this report. I think it's really significant, both in terms of the national report, but also in terms of the ACT as well. I want to tell you a little bit about the Smart Energy Council and our relationship with China, and also our industry's relationship with China. The Smart Energy Council is a peak national body for the renewable energy industry in Australia. We have about 1,300 member companies around Australia, and we cover everything from household solar and battery storage through to large-scale renewable energy projects, solar farms, wind farms, do a lot of work around electric vehicles and the integration of electric vehicles into the energy grid, and increasingly doing a lot of work around renewable hydrogen, green iron, green metals. And in each of those areas, there's really very, very significant intersections with China as well. And so China made a strategic decision, a very clear decision from the Chinese government to be the world leader when it comes to smart energy, renewable energy, and that strategic decision has absolutely changed the world. And so roughly, 90%, 90 to 95% of the solar panels that come to Australia come from China. Probably a similar number in terms of battery storage systems. Increasingly, electric vehicles are coming from China, and that relationship between Australia and China that was mentioned in terms of particularly the relationship with WA in relation to iron ore and critical minerals, a really critical relationship between Australia and China as well. Our member companies cover everything from big global manufacturers of smart energy products, including a significant number of Chinese companies. Other companies working in that green iron space, Fortescue Metals is a good example of that, but also a significant number of sort of mums and dad businesses, people who install solar panels and battery storage systems and other things. And so at a whole bunch of different points, there's a really significant interaction with China. And just picking up on the report in particular, I think one of the things that really struck me was the cost of living consequences of imports from China. And so have a think about this. If you have solar on your roof, solar saves money. The best way you can save money on your power bills, if you're in a position to do so, is to have solar on your roof. The best way to reduce your fuel costs, if you're in a position to do so, is to get an electric vehicle. If you get a battery storage system with solar, you take control over how you produce electricity. All of those things are really dominated by the relationship with China. There are some people in the past who have suggested that we put up tariffs on solar panels, for example, coming into Australia to allow Australian companies to manufacture in Australia. That would very, very significantly increase cost of living pressures on all Australians. And that's something that we're fundamentally opposed to. There's a debate on right now about suggesting the US is putting significant tariffs on electric vehicles going into the US from China. We don't manufacture electric vehicles in Australia. If we do that in Australia, we would very significantly increase the cost of electric vehicles at a time when electric vehicle prices are going to come down really dramatically. And again, that would be a cost of living disaster. And so that's a reflection on some of the things that was mentioned, I think, in that report. Our view, we are, because something like 95% of solar panels and other products come from China. Two things really important, or three things really. One is that the trade relationship with China is fundamentally important. That's the first thing. Secondly, there's a need globally and in Australia to diversify supply chains. There's no doubt about that. And we're doing a lot of work in that space. You can't have a situation where one country dominates 95% of supply chains. And so there is a need to diversify. And there's also a need to build up Australian sovereign capacity as well. And so we strongly support the Australian government's Future Made in Australia program as well. But our strong view is that a future made in Australia is a future made in partnership with China. And so one of the things that the Australian government still needs to work out, I think, is what role can China play and Chinese companies play in the future of made in Australia. But we are very strongly of the view that you can't shut out China from those important programs. Let me tell you a little bit about our relationship with China. I've been to China, fortunately, probably about 8 times now, with a particular focus around Shanghai and Jiangsu province, which really leads the world when it comes to smart energy manufacturing. And we took a delegation to China in June this year. Wrong button. This button. There you go. Oh, that tells you a little bit about it. There we go. This is our delegation. So a delegation of 20 companies, to China. It was our third delegation to China, trade delegation, 20 people led by Anastasia Palaszczuk, the former Queensland Premier, who's the international ambassador to the Smart Energy Council. It's fantastic having her as the leader of that delegation, and that really opened up a lot of doors, including senior engagement with the Chinese government officials as well. As Queensland Premier, Brisbane has a sister relationship with Shanghai, and so Anastasia Palaszczuk has been to China many times before, and Shanghai many times before, and so there's some very good relationships there that really helped us as well. My core point, I think, today is that trade delegations really matter. And the 20 companies that were involved in our trade delegation got a lot from that. I know the ACT government does trade delegations. I'd really encourage people to get involved in the trade delegations. And the reasons why they're important is because, particularly for people who are new to China and looking at opportunities, it is a fantastic way to get to understand the country, working with and talking to people who are already engaging in China and have a bunch of relationships. What we found, and this is, as I said, our third delegation, what we find is that moment you watch the people enter China, visit the country, and the look on their face, and they're like, oh my God, I did not expect this. And every single time the feeling is that, there is a stereotypical view of China, and then they see China, the reality of China, whether it's a big city like Shanghai, or going on the high-speed train and just traveling through China and just seeing the extraordinary progress there and the extraordinary infrastructure. That's an amazing experience, and so I really encourage that. On our delegation, we visited a bunch of different places, and that's important for those trade relationships. So very deliberately, we visited companies like, there's some photos of just some of the things we saw. JA Solar, which is one of the world's largest solar manufacturers. So we visited their factories, saw what they were doing. SunGrow, one of the world's biggest inverter manufacturers. NIO, one of China's leading electric vehicle companies. We went to the Tesla Gigafactory. We went and visited a company called Guofuhe, which is a leading renewable hydrogen company and an electrolyzer manufacturer. We visited and we formed a partnership with SNEC, which is a Shanghai New Energy Conference. It's the world's biggest renewable energy conference, held in Shanghai every year. Gets about 400,000 delegates, so basically the size of Canberra in one conference. It's I don't know, it's probably 100 times the convention centre here, I would think, at least, right? You take a bus between the different parts of the show. It's the most extraordinary experience in that. TW Solar and some other companies as well. And it was a really great opportunity for individual companies to build those relationships in their sectors and some of those trade relationships as well. We've got member companies that are looking at opportunities to bring electric vehicles, for example, Chinese electric vehicles into Australia. We've got members who are looking to build partnerships, working both ways with Chinese companies. There are a number of member companies that are looking at services opportunities. So, for example, training for solar installers or understanding regulations and those sorts of things as well. So they're all involved in the delegation. And I might just tell you a couple of quick stories, which goes to just how much China is changing the world as well, and particularly in the electric vehicle space. So we visited a company called NIO, N-I-O. I mentioned before, probably one of China's, I think it's a NIO car there, one of the the beautiful car, and doesn't actually have a product in Australia yet, but I'm really hoping that they do. So we visited their factory near Shanghai, fully automated. They produce one electric vehicle every 30 seconds. We visited the Tesla Gigafactory, not quite fully automated yet, right? So not as advanced as NIO. They only produce one electric vehicle every minute. 50% of all new vehicle sales in China are electric vehicles. And so China is changing the world, right? And it's just that the world hasn't worked it out yet. And Australia certainly hasn't worked it out yet. I'm very, very confident, subject to other things, that we'll see a significant number of new Chinese brands coming to Australia next year and the year after, and the prices of electric vehicles are coming down really significantly. We're going to see a reasonable number now. They're going to be under $40,000, and soon some that'll be under $30,000. And again, that's going to change the world, I think. So that's been really significant. We engage very, very closely with Austrade in Shanghai and the Australian Consul General in Shanghai, and we're fortunate enough to go to an event which was the 40th anniversary of the Australian Consul General in Shanghai, actually, which is a fantastic event and a great opportunity to also engage with local businesses there across the board, but also engage with senior Chinese government officials in Shanghai as well. And we're now committed to doing an annual exchange, an annual smart energy roundtable with China, organised by the Smart Energy Council. So 1 year in Shanghai and the next year in Sydney. So actually next year is in Sydney and the year after in Shanghai. We'll do that as a regular thing. And that's going to be very, very important in terms of that relationship as well. And probably just a final thing I might just mention as well, a bunch of us from Canberra were on that delegation, and it's so much easier to tell the story about what Australia is doing when it comes to renewables when you come from Canberra. And just want to pay tribute to the work of Andrew Barr, in particular as Chief Minister, Shane Rattenbury as Energy Minister, in the commitment to 100% renewables by ACT already at 100% renewables, and extraordinary commitments to emissions reduction in the ACT. It's a great story that we can tell, and there's a lot that China can actually learn from the ACT experience, for good and bad, of getting to 100% renewables and managing the grid. And then just finally, if I just acknowledge the work of Brendan Smith and his team as well, that's really important in building those relationships as well, and encourage people to get involved in that. So hopefully that's some useful reflections. Thanks, Greg.
Excellent. Thank you, Wayne. We might turn now to Chris. Chris Gartner is the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Future Students at the University of Canberra. So he leads UC's student recruitment and admissions, both domestic and international, and oversees educational delivery across commercial, domestic and transnational partnerships. And amongst other things, manages global student mobility and international engagement. Now, international students here in Canberra spend $300 million a year in the local economy, so that's huge. How important is the China relationship to UC?
Oh, it's fundamental to UC, as it is for most of the international education sector here in Australia. Look, the need to be able to draw on the data that research activity like this is offering us is fun. I'm not on? I'm green, right? I'm on? Yeah. The need to be able to draw on data-driven insights to inform the debate around the future relationship between Australia and China, I would say right now is is fundamental to the international education sector. There is a significant reform agenda that the government is driving, and a lot of that reform agenda is very much underpinned by a concern that the broader benefits that international education brings to Australia are not sufficient to outweigh some of the costs that people ascribe to international education. So we talk quite extensively about the loss of social licence that international education in Australia, and international education which is very much around engagement with China, but also more broadly, has in this country. And so cost of living crisis, housing affordability are very much now synonymous with conversations about international education in this country. And this report in particular, I guess, demonstrates from a dollar perspective, but also hints at the person-to-person and non-tangible elements that we benefit from as a country. What I thought I would do is just give you a sense of the University of Canberra's engagement with China and what that looks and feels like, because I think quite often people assume that international education. Am I coming through? Is it? Yeah. Is that better now? 1, 2, 3. Further away. Toward. Is that better now? Green light is on. Keep going? Okay. The size and shape of what international education looks like at a university like the University of Canberra, but not just higher education universities. I do acknowledge I've got a colleague here from CIT, and the vet sector has had a long tradition of supporting international education exchange between our two countries. So the University of Canberra is 35 years old as a university, and we enrolled our first Chinese international student in our first year of operation as a university in the 1990s. Today, 20% of our students are international students, and 5% of our student body in total is from China. When I talk about international students from China, most people assume that I am talking about students that have travelled and are now resident in Canberra. Indeed, the majority of our Chinese students do fit that category, but a third of our Chinese students are actually studying a University of Canberra degree in China through one of our partnerships with universities there. So a full University of Canberra degree studied in English in China. A third of our student base study an Australian and a University of Canberra degree that way. We have been in these types of relationships and engagements in China for over 25 years. Our partnership with East China University of Science and Technology, where we deliver our MBA to 100 students each year, is celebrating its 25th anniversary next year. And for every year across those 25 years, we have had a significantly large cohort of students come through, engage with Australian education product, engage with our intellectual property and ways of doing business in this country, and are now doing business in China and across the world with an affiliation and understanding of Australian education and ways of doing business. Our ability to quantify that, so transnational education of that type as a university and as a sector, is really challenging. But I think people in this room can appreciate that those tangible and intangible benefits around that affinity, that regard, that person-to-person connection, be it through lecturers that have gone across, be it through alumni engagement activity, really do generate benefit for Australia, and the regard with which a burgeoning business community in China are really, really very much growing and have grown over the last 2.5 decades. The data which is pointed to in the report really does try to quantify the benefit down to dollars. And dollars that we can quantify in a given financial or calendar year. And that is important, and that's very much important when it comes to discussions about the future trajectory of international education. But I want to talk about a couple of things that I speak to our students, our domestic students in Australia about, around why it's important to really value the connections that they build in the classroom with Chinese students and all international students for that matter. We talk about the future of Australia's relationship and prosperity being one which is globally oriented. And we talk about in this country the need for people to be Asia literate. And we talk about the need for us to have an appreciation of the ways in which other people do business, how they run their societies, the ways that they engage with each other. Traditionally, when we have said Australian students need to understand these different ways of being and operating in the world, we've talked about global mobility and sending students offshore. And certainly that's an important and very significant way in which we do that. But increasingly, we need to be thinking more about the international education experience that students here in Australia can benefit from in this country. The fact that you are sitting next to a 5% of our student cohort in Canberra drawn from China is an opportunity for us to build those person-to-person relationships and have an appreciation of a significant trading partner, social and cultural partner that is going to be very important to Australia's future trajectory for quite a while. Those are the types of benefits that are accrued by an international education sector which is robust and diverse, that we need to start talking about in addition to export dollars and dollars accrued from student fees or people living in a particular location. When I talk to students who are perhaps moving to Canberra as the big smoke from regional parts of New South Wales or more broadly, so Canberra is the big town, inevitably when you ask them what looks different what is something different that you are able to experience in Canberra that you weren't able to experience where you've come from in a regional location? And you go down the list, and inevitably, 4th, 5th or 6th is the comment that I've discovered bubble tea. And I use the bubble tea example because it's a nice little microcosm around the impact socially and culturally that international education has injected into this country. Very few capital cities in Australia would have a bubble tea network or bubble tea industry if it wasn't for international students. And again, it might seem trivial, but it is, I guess, an indication of how ubiquitous to everyday life the location of a robust international education sector has here in Canberra, but also more broadly across Australia. So I guess in terms of my sort of couple of take-home points, yes, talking about the dollar impact of international education to Australia, to Canberra, is important. Being able to quantify that so that we can have meaningful cut-through conversations at a time where acceptance and appreciation of the contribution of international education is waning somewhat is important. But we can't forget some of those non-tangible benefits. We can't also forget that those non-tangible benefits are really what makes an in-your-face, right here, right now difference to students and individuals. We can't forget that Chinese students who come here are people. And when we talk about things only from the perspective of the dollar benefit, we are talking about people, and nobody likes to be quantified right down to just a dollar figure. And so I'm hoping that contributions like this mean that we can have a more holistic discussion about the future of international education in this country. One more point, and I might take Wayne's lead about reflecting on how China is changing and how the China of 2024, from a student and education expectation perspective, is very different from the China of 2019, let alone the China of 1993. Many of my colleagues in international education have sort of talked about the expectation that Chinese students have around prestige and the regard around prestige that drives decision-making about whether or not to pursue an international education. Certainly in many cultures, and China is one of them, the regard with which an education institution and the degree that you are offering is an important factor. So institutional rankings, those kinds of things are important. But increasingly, the challenges that China is facing mirror those that we are facing right across the world, including here in Australia. So families are being squeezed financially. Cost of living is an issue in China now. I was just there 2 weeks ago visiting a range of collaborative partners that we engage with, and they all mentioned cost of living. Parents are wanting to understand, are their kids going to get a job when they graduate from your degree? Is that job going to be a secure job? Is that job actually going to turn into a career that is long-term and secure? And they're exactly the same questions that parents here in Australia are asking. People in their 20s are asking questions around how's the welfare of my aging parents going to be taken care of? Is social infrastructure, healthcare, social support, aged care sufficiently developed in my country in order to be able to manage some of those demographic shifts and obligations that people have for elder generations? Guess what? They're the same questions that we're asking here in Australia. So one of the changes that I think we all have to come to terms with is that some of those big challenging questions that Australia is asking are also being asked by people in China and elsewhere in the world. And we don't necessarily always have the answers. But embarking on a conversation and an engagement with our partners in China, which is very much about finding shared solutions, is of benefit to our Chinese partners. But dare I say, it's probably also of benefit to us here in Australia as we grapple with some of those grand challenges. So again, I'm looking forward to the interactive conversation later on, but they're just a few reflections from the perspective of an international education provider and a university. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll turn now to Brendan. So Brendan Smith is the Commissioner of International Engagement for ACT Government. He leads the Office of International Engagement, which coordinates international relations on behalf of the ACT and collaborates with Enterprise Canberra. He is responsible for strategies to enhance Canberra's global reputation and promote it as a key destination for investment, business and education, as well, of course, as two-way trade. So Brendan, what's your take on what we've just heard?
Thank you, Greg, and I'd like to largely agree with my two fellow speakers here, but I'll have a slightly different take on it. Firstly, I would also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, what they contribute to our society, past, present and emerging, but more importantly, acknowledging that they were the first exporters. Australia, the British found us in 1770, thank God for that, nice to be found. But the Chinese were probably here 300 or 400 years before that through the treasure fleets of that the Emperor had sent out, and there's lots of indications, including maps, that they were here well before Cook, and Cook may have had a Chinese map. So we know that the Indigenous people were exporters, and we know that there are trade routes across Australia to the north, and goods from all over Australia have ended up in Asia. It's a bit of a China day for me. We were lucky enough to have a delegation in this morning from the Shanghai Data Corporation. Lunch was at the embassy to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic. And of course, we're here now. So I'd certainly like to say thanks to a whole lot of acronyms. Thanks to the CBC, the ACBC, the KWM and the BCEC for all their good work, but particularly to Daniel for putting the report together. And what Daniel's report highlight, I think, if you look through the report for the ACT, is really the lack of accurate data for Canberra. It's a real issue in that often exports are from the last port, and often imports are recorded against the port of arrival. Now, the second last slide that Daniel had said there were $350,000 worth of imports into the ACT. That's about 5 Teslas. Now, the only right-hand drive Tesla factory in the world is in Shanghai, and the ACT, 1 in 4 cars registered since the start of the year are EVs. So de rigueur in the ACT is a puffer jacket in the winter, and you drive your Tesla. So the problem for statisticians and economists like Daniel, and for politicians and for bureaucrats is the lack of real data about the ACT, and that's something the Ministerial Council on Trade and Investment is working on, because until we know that real number, it's very hard to get an accurate take on what it's all about. The dollars matter, the relationships matter more, and there's a very long-term relationship between Australia and China, and without a doubt, they're not noted, but without a doubt, on those ships of the First Fleet, there would be people of all different nationalities, including Chinese. But we know that the first known Chinese immigrant to Australia got here on the 27th of February, 1818, a guy called Mak Sai Ting, landed in Sydney from Guangzhou, immediately went to Parramatta, and what did he set up? A pub. All right, he had a pub. He then set up an undertaking firm, so death and alcohol, and then he commenced trade. And we know that he travelled backwards and forwards between Guangzhou, and he and his family. He was a trader, and that tradition continues to today, and it's a very good thing. For the ACT, the opportunity that we exist, certainly the strong points at the moment are education and tourism. The student numbers are not back to where they were pre-COVID, but we're keen to see that occur. And because of the renewal of flights and the relaxation of border controls, I believe if they're not, China is about to become our #1 source of inbound tourists to the ACT, which they were before COVID set in. In terms of sustainability, the relationship there is very important. Institutions like the ANU, one of the 6 university campuses here in the ACT, Andrew Blacker's, Lachlan Blackhall developed a whole lot of solar technologies. One in particular was slither technology. So it's the surface area of the solar cell, not the thickness of the silicon, that matters. And they found a way of, Andrew Black has found a way of making it much finer. and that technology is now all around the world, and the relationship between Australian research institutions and the growth of solar product out of Asia, out of China in particular, is well known. Chris made a good point about aged care. We know that a Canberra firm, Aspen Medical, was looking at doing aged care projects in China because of the way the Chinese demographics are changing. That was before COVID. I'm not sure if that's been renewed, but it certainly is something that Australia's got a lot of expertise in. And then food and agri-tech. So these are the things that we've got now. There are other things that are emerging that we believe will have a huge benefit and impact on the trade. And particularly when you take into account that it's 70% of China will be considered middle class by 2030, according to the report, the excellent report, then that's an opportunity as well to grow the education, to grow the tourism, and to grow the consumption of products. I look at page, what are we on? Page 19, table figure 6. Unfortunately, the big ticket items that go to China, wheat, wool, beef, barley, iron ore, crude minerals, coal, copper. We tend not to have very much of that in the ACT. We've got 62 rural leaseholders, and I don't think too many of them export to China. And the only naturally occurring element that we could grow, that we could mine out of the ground, is a very large deposit of arsenic that exists in Deakin. I'm not sure there's a market for arsenic around the world anymore, but we'll look at that. I think if you then go to figure 20 in the report, it's amazing. You look at 2016 when CHAFTA was signed, it was about 15% of the trade as a share of GSP GDP. So 15% in 2016. 7 years later, it's almost 40%. And it just shows you the importance of free trade. It shows you the importance of the relaxing of barriers, and it shows you the potential that exists there. And that's why I say the dollars are important, but the relationship matters oh so much more. And we see it in things like intellectual property. Canberrans take out patents and trademarks at twice the national average. This is not a city that's endowed, as I said, with agricultural mineral resources, but it's endowed with brilliant people, absolutely brilliant people coming out of our brilliant educational facilities that have amazing ideas. And so that relationship between services and Canberra and China is very important into the future. I do appreciate the bubble teas comment, and I note with some sadness that the gentleman that coined the phrase while being elected, by being arrested by the New South Wales, maybe Queensland Police, who coined the phrase of "I was just enjoying a succulent Chinese meal," is just a byword in Australia. I mean, it's just part of the landscape. China is part of what we do, and I think most people appreciate and recognise that. So how does the ACT government how does the ACT government support this? So the Office of International Engagement was set up to help exporters largely. We want to find more places to send our goods. We want to find more markets. We want more tourists and students to come here. We want more investment. But we want it as a two-way street. And so later this year, we'll celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Canberra-Beijing Friendship Park just down at Lennox Gardens. And next year, we'll celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Canberra-Beijing Sister City relationship. And these are important relationships. And we would see many, many Chinese delegations through every year. So some of the things the Office of International Engagement does is we arrange the trade missions for the Chief Minister and all ACT ministers to all places, including China. We then welcome inbound delegations. And as I said, this morning we had the delegation of Shanghai Municipal Bureau of Data. It was 6 gentlemen. Sorry, ladies, it was all gentlemen. But we had a chat about data, how you use data, how you analyse data, how you store data. Data is an issue for all of us, and maintaining sovereignty and protecting your data is important. And they came to Canberra to go to our innovation centre, the Canberra Innovation Network, to learn what they're doing. And I think that signifies, again, the respect that Canberra has as a provider of services. We have a trade start advisor, and Mark is with us. Mark Faulkner's just joined the team. So we work very closely with the Commonwealth to take businesses that are about to export or are exporting, to get them there or to accelerate their growth and make sure they get the support there. And Mark is supported by his colleagues, Richard and Hashi, and that's our export development team. It's about training, it's about pitch development, it's about making sure they're ready to go onto trade missions so that that they get the benefit and we get the benefit. We work with the Canberra Business Chamber. We work very closely with them. They run an international business program for us, and this is one of these events. And then the Chamber and the CR, all these acronyms, CRJO and the RDO, so the Canberra Region Joint Organisation, the 8 surrounding shires of New South Wales. We work with them as well to make sure that they're aware of the opportunity. So, for instance, we will often take New South Wales firms with us on trade missions. Business doesn't see borders, particularly in Australia, and it's really good to be able to make sure that we include them as well. Looking forward, some of the things, I've made the comment about regulation, free trade works. Look at the chapter table on page 20. It is stark. When you reduce barriers, you improve trade. We're very keen for flights, and I know the ambassador told the Chief Minister that his #1 objective was a direct flight between Beijing and Canberra so that he didn't have to go through Sydney, to which I think we all agree. Language is a barrier, and Australians haven't paid enough attention to studying all other languages. We still have a little sort of cultural hangover from our days of being Anglophiles, of learning French and German, but Asian languages and particularly Chinese needed to be treated with respect. Custom and tradition, we need to understand each other better. We need to understand where we stand, where you stand, and how we stand together. And I think it's about consumer behaviour. It is about watching what's happening in China. It is about what happens when a country lifts 100 million people out of poverty and draws them up into the middle class, what the possibilities are for that country, in this case China, but particularly what are the opportunities for us as exporters and traders. So look, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of great work that has been done. But I do often wonder what Max Aiting would say, 230 years later, having arrived in Australia in a windjammer and set up a pub, and we know where the pub is. I think it's still called the Golden Dragon in Parramatta. What he would think of the relationship today. I think he'd be pleased. And I think he'd still see that there is immense opportunity where people come together and work together and show each other respect, that you then can trade, that you then can have a relationship, and then you can work together and lift everyone up. And I think it's as a partnership that this works best. And I'll leave it there.
Brendan, thank you very much for that. It's certainly, I think, very clear that the trade relationship is much more sophisticated now than it was in 1818 or whatever it was that he arrived into Sydney, and obviously delivering far greater benefits to everyone. We've got the opportunity now to have some questions from the floor. So if there is anyone who's got any questions, please sing out. We will find a microphone so that you can be heard. But Daniel, I had a question for you, jumping back to you over in Perth, and I'll just acknowledge Dr. Abibi Haley Mariam, who's joining you, one of the co-authors of the report. 4.2% reduction in the cost of living is a significant number and shows the benefits of trading with China. But if I understood correctly, that was comparing to other imported goods. Did you do any modelling on the benefits of trade with China compared to the cost of producing those goods domestically, and what that might have meant?
Well, the modelling looked at what's the next best alternative. So whether it's internationally sourced or domestically produced, if we were to source those products from the next best alternative, what would be the additional costs? So again, they could be domestically or internationally sourced. Again, luckily with the data, we're able to look at with the vast basket of goods and then the price of those from the next best alternative economy or domestically produced. And just to go back to Brendan's point as well, I very much agree with you, Brendan. There are limitations with the data, and I should have pointed to that further, as you say, in terms of point of entry of imports or point of exit. That's where the data is collected. And yeah, of course, there are limitations. We don't know exactly where those goods may end up being consumed or used within the nation, which again, there's certainly caution with some of those low numbers reported for the ACT due to data limitations. But naturally, I think we could look more to that. The national level is more likely to be more aligned with the actual impact for the ACT as well.
Yeah, and we understand that, and we're working. Ministerial Council on Trade and Investment is seriously looking at improving the data other agencies collect but don't release it. And I do have to say, that's a fine West Australian accent that you have.
Yes, yes. Well, I thought you were talking about an Irishman when you talked about a pub and funeral home. So, yeah.
Excellent. Sorry, a question over here. I'll just find the microphone for you.
Thanks very much. Annabel Griffin from Kingwood Mallesons, also with a strong Australian accent.
Yes.
My question is, do households in the ACT understand the benefit that trade with China presents to us? And if more can be done, what should be done?
Who wants to take that? Brendan, do you want to kick off?
I'd take the view that probably without a report like this, most Australians, not just Canberrans, but most Australians don't understand the importance of it. And I think the notion of bringing it down to the impact per household is a good way of doing it. If we reduce the number of Chinese students to zero, the number of professors and support staff at our universities would drop dramatically. So just straight up, you can quantify if 9,000 of our students are from China, how many academics and support staff and facilities does that represent? So there is a story. I think part of it is perhaps the Chinese embassy can help us tell that story, but you can't tell the story without that data, and that's why Daniel's work is so important. I think the flip side of that is I think there is an innate recognition, if not an understanding of it. And the fact that the National Multicultural Festival that we have every February in Canberra, this year, 440,000 people went. So the entire population of Canberra basically turns up in a weekend, grew out of the celebration of the Chinese New Year. And all the other countries said, hang on, we want part of this as well. There is a Canberra-Beijing friendship garden here. We've only 3 sister cities. Beijing is one of those. And for those that don't know, Jackie Chan was invented in Canberra. So Jackie Chan is a Canberra resident. He arrived here with a different name, but after a couple of years, he reinvented himself and left as Jackie Chan. And he says this in his biography. So there's all of these attachments that I think we take for granted. But until somebody with the skill of Daniel paints us a picture, it becomes much easier to understand.
Can I just add to that? In terms of if we look at employment impact, yes, there are a number of staff that are employed by universities and TAFE institutions and other education institutions whose jobs would be at risk if international students suddenly disappeared. But that's only one part of the sector that a robust international education environment supports. If you take 9,000 people out of a city, any city, there are a range of other impacts that you will see around the service economy to service that population's purely living here. And, I could make the joke now, half the bubble tea shops might close. But seriously, if we think about real estate, if we think about chemists, if we think about, retail, grocery, all of that has a flow-on effect from having a significant population of international students here or Chinese students here. So the translation into the labour market is significant. The other thing that I'll say about data is that the international education sector has its own, challenges with data, and that's around the interface between tourism and international education-related visitations. We talk about visiting friends and family when we talk about international education. A large proportion of people that might visit from China or Southeast Asia or South Asia are here because their children or family members are studying here. And so the flow-on effects from international education into the tourism sector are elements that I think we need to better understand more broadly in the wider community as well.
Yeah. And one institution, not Chris's, used to have 2 graduations a year. They dropped one, and there was immediate outcry from the family saying, we can't come unless it's then. And that there is a direct correlation then to the tourism. The other point is that during COVID, I had a second job. I was the ACT's COVID-19 Local Business Commissioner. My team and I got to deal with all the businesses on their commercial tenancies. And as we emerged from COVID, the big issue was the lack of staff, and our international students, all students, but particularly our international students, provided a lot of the workforce that kept a whole lot of businesses going. So that certainly we were learning from them, they were learning from us, we were learning together. And again, it's that relationship. And I don't think you can, as Chris has said and as Wayne has said, you cannot put a value on those friendships.
Baby and Daniel, your report, your report obviously goes a long way towards unpacking some of the mysteries surrounding the relationship. But do you have a sense as to how well understood the magnitude of the relationship is, or the size of the benefits that are flowing into the community?
Look, I think, again, I think the benefits of reports like this is that it's getting out there and informing these public discussions and debates. I think, again, being able to speak to the data and bring it down to the household level. What does this mean for the average person? I think they're really important discussions. And again, the importance, as has been pointed out, of data and research like this. I think more needs to be done to communicate this to the general public. I think, government officials, policy people are well aware, obviously industry that's engaging with China are well aware of the benefits and the importance of the trade relationship. But the average person doesn't necessarily always understand or are aware of those benefits. And I think, some of the kind of the comments that might be made in certain agendas that relate to negative comments around China and the relationship, there's a lack of good understanding around the importance of the relationship and the positive benefits. And again, it's not just we were saying here at our research centre that every economic issue has a social dimension. So as Chris and others pointed out there, it's not just about the dollar value, it's about these spillover benefits that occur in our society, and that shared understanding of each other's culture that are so important.
If I could pick up on that, on page 37 of the report, there's a photograph with a quote that says a 1% increase in trade intensity within China decreases unemployment in Australia by 0.25%. Now, we know from all of the studies, the social determinants of health are dominated by a roof over my head and a job to go to. And so if you think about this, if the GDP chart that I quoted earlier went from 15% to 40% since chapter was signed, how much is that cumulative effect in just the personal well-being of Australians, in that they have a job, they feel valued, that allows them to put a roof over their head and food on the table for their families. And again, I think it's facts like that are particularly useful, Daniel, and I'm much appreciative.
All right. Sorry, question down the back there.
Thanks, Brian Clark from the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. I'm certainly hoping you bottle this conversation, because as you're all pointing out, there's a terrifically good story to tell, which perhaps isn't coming out as well as it might. And so if I have 2 questions relative to this, Danny, in the first instance, how often has a report like this been done, so that we were informed fully? Is there other reports that can also be drawn upon? And I'm hoping, eventually somebody chucks this stuff into the media. And my second question, more broadly to the panel, is there's a strong dialogue that goes on around Australia's trade relationship with China, obviously, as you pointed out, which is very good and very positive. And there is a second conversation which goes on about national security, which says it is very bad and we should all be wary and, cautious of the relationship. How are you all managing that tension?
Where do we start there, Wayne?
We'll start with the second question first, and it's a really good one, obviously, and it's really interesting, and so I can answer it from a renewable energy perspective, right? Renewable energy industry perspective, and obviously we had a significant period of time in which there wasn't a great relationship between Australia and China, but the relationship in the renewable energy industry was really good, and so it's actually the renewables industry, the smart energy industry, which has been able to, and this is our message to governments as well, it's a fantastic way to tell the story about the opportunities for that relationship between Australia and China. Like there's clear benefits on both sides. Australia invented solar effectively, China commercialised it, and together we're delivering, climate change solutions to the world. And so that's been really good. The renewables industry has been able to navigate some of the rocky relationships, and in relation to the security issues, we're always conscious of that. There are broader issues around investment, for example, in Australia, investment in critical minerals, which is there's been some changes to foreign investment arrangements. That's not just about China, but obviously China is part of that, even if it's not necessarily mentioned. Cybersecurity is another issue that comes up all the time, certainly in our industry. Again, not just about China, but it is part of that relationship. And so trying to find ways to navigate that's really important, and having constructive, mature dialogue around those issues is really important. I actually think having an industry perspective on those issues is really important, right? Because it just provides another element to the discussion, and too often the discussion gets biased in terms of one specific direction. And I think some of these industry discussions can make it a little bit more pragmatic, and perhaps more realistic as well.
Daniel, did you want to pick up on the question about how often this report's produced?
Yeah, well, look, again, we did a report with ACBC WA last year that looked at the impact on households at this WA state level. This is the first that we've done for the national level. Look, we've a really nice relationship with ACBC, and hope that will continue, and that this can be perhaps an annual report where we provide updates based on changes in trade intensity. But I think there are other, as has been identified here, key aspects of research that need to be understood and delved into further. The renewables, the achievement of net zero targets, the partnering and relationship between China and Australia, and understanding how each plays a role in the overall supply chain to achieve this and to do so together. I think more needs to be done to better understand that, and including identify the risks that may exist in that as well. So if there are different strategies playing out across both economies, what does that actually mean? What does it imply for the economies? So yeah, certainly plenty of research that can be done. I think definitely more that needs to be understood around things like renewables, net zero targets, the energy sector, but also international education, and not only understanding the dollar value again, but what are those spillover effects across cultural understanding, soft diplomacy, and so on, that are really critical.
Just quickly on that second question, again, just going back to that about security issues as well. Like, it's really important to mention, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers is on his way to China now. He may well be even have arrived in China. And so that's really, really significant, obviously. It'll be very interesting to see exactly what's discussed, how those meetings and those relationships are communicated, both in China and in Australia. But hopefully that's a signal that you can have multifaceted relationships, and that you can have strong trade relationships, and continue the dialogue around other issues.
Brendan, from an ACT government point of view, I appreciate those broader political questions are federal, but to what extent do you think strong commercial relationships and strong people-to-people relationships actually underpin some of that improved political and security understanding that we probably need?
Well, I'd be slightly more specific and say, what does the business relationship show? And if you look back to about 2016, I think two-way trade was about 175 billion per annum, and it's now 330, and it has grown every year, both through COVID, and we all know that there's been some difficulties recently. So quite clearly business understands and business gets on with it. Politicians will have a different view, and look, you know, the Australian government and all governments in Australia are committed to the rules-based order about making sure laws are enforced. Countries are entitled to their sovereignty, and countries are entitled to live peacefully and in a prosperous way. But it's about using reports like Daniel's written, and if he'd like to talk to page 30, you know, US investment in Australia as a percentage of total investment is 24%. China, it's 2%. But you get this hysteria over Chinese investment in Australia. They're buying the farm, we're selling the future, and the numbers just don't bear that out. And so the value of a document like this is to be able to say, here it is in a very simple chart. And if I read it, China's relative share of overall foreign investment in Australia has actually declined since 2015. So depending on where we're looking for and what we're after, there's still a lot of work to be done, but the story's got to be done in the context of the facts, and reports like this from credible sources are very, very useful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Sorry. Sorry, we just need the microphone so that our Perth colleagues can...
Hi, Shell Christian from CIT Solutions. Maybe just some questions around the international education, probably to Chris. You were talking about social licence. I wonder, what metrics do we have?
If I was going to be a little bit cheeky, I'd say the calibre of the conversation that we're having around the caps that are being applied to your institution and my institution is a pretty good blunt metric of how we measure whether the social licence is intact or not. That's probably not going to be a sustainable or robust way forward. I know in my sector, in the university sector, we have for quite a while now been working through how we build the type of awareness and the appreciation that we have all touched on today. That work is ongoing. I suspect, however, that there are some crosswinds that need to pass first before we start an effort to rebuild that conversation about the broad benefits of international education from an economic but then also social perspective. I think right now we're in the heat of the moment, and anything that someone like you or I says will be viewed through that lens and probably in a counterproductive fashion. I think in the run-up to next year and what is happening on the federal scene next year, we should be preparing ourselves for a frank and robust conversation. Sorry, that was a very, yeah.
Anyone else want to comment on that? And were there any other questions from our audience here today?
Could I just loop back to an earlier point from Brendan on the investment, and again, you know, thanks for pointing that out, Brendan. Again, I think there's a more work to be done on understanding some of that investment data as well. Further work to be done there, but also, you know, again, flipping it into a positive is that there's such a massive opportunity to build the relationship with China, to increase investment. Again, take battery manufacturing as an example, and you know, here in WA where we have a lot of the critical minerals required, but in doing some of the downstream activities and where we can add value here in Western Australia or in other states and territories as well, but we may require investment from the likes of Chinese entities. So again, there's massive opportunity there. This report, I think a comment from the audience around media has actually received quite significant media coverage, not just in Australia but also in China. And you know, again, I think that can you know, informing the general public and the community, so that as been pointed out again, that good research, well informed discussions through proper use of data do properly inform the discussions, not only at the general policy making as well, both here and in China.
All right, thank you, Daniel. There's just a little glitch in some of the internet there, I think, on the line, but we got the gist of what you were saying. Just to close off, we've probably just got time for a couple more questions. Brendan, I'll just come to you. We heard a little bit about trade missions and the value of trade missions in building trade relationships. Are there ACT government plans for delegations to China in the near future?
Well, given that the ACT government culminates on the 19th of October, I'm hoping a new Chinese government, ACT government culminates, sorry about that, ACT government culminates on the 19th of October. Yes, I've got a 3-year forward program, and that will be presented to the incoming Chief Minister, whoever that might be. But certainly top of the list is China. As I said, next year is the 25th anniversary of the Canberra-Beijing sister city relationship, and we've looked at the existing agreement, which was sort of written in the year 2000, and so it's kind of, very basic sort of agreement. But we've learnt since then that agreements that define your objectives much more clearly and have ambitious targets work along the line of the agreement we have with Wellington in New Zealand. And the last discussion we had with the Mayor before COVID set in, the Chief Minister met with the Mayor, there was a view that we rewrite it and we become very ambitious. And I would hope an incoming Chief Minister would have that view.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to working with you on that from a business point of view.
Yes, the ideal would be to take a delegation with the Chief Minister's trade mission.
All right. Look, if there's nothing further, we might just draw this to a close. So, look, I would like to thank all of our audience for coming today, but I'd particularly like to thank our panelists, Daniel Kiley and Bibi Haley Mariam from Curtin University, coming in from Perth. Really appreciate you joining us remotely for this. Wayne Smith, Chris Gartner and Brendan Smith, and of course Angela Lehman from the Australia-China Business Council. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Lots of key learnings and outtakes, I think, about the value of the China relationship and how businesses can make the most of those opportunities. I was particularly excited to know that Jackie Chan is actually one of Canberra's greatest exports, which I did not know before today. And I'd also just like to thank, again, ACT Government for its support of this event, and King & Wood Mallesons for hosting us here today. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope that's been useful, and look forward to catching up with you perhaps afterwards. Thank you very much.